Operation Paperclip is a story of contradictions that begins in the last days of the Second World War and winds its way through the Cold War, the space race, and the moral compromises made in the name of national security. When Nazi Germany collapsed in the spring of 1945, Allied forces fanned out across Europe to seize weapons, documents, and above all people. British and American intelligence officers were not just looking for blueprints or stockpiles of rockets. They were hunting the brains behind Hitler's war machine. The United States formed the Combined Intelligence Objectives Subcommittee, a joint effort with more than 3,000 technical experts, to locate scientists who could be useful to the Allies. In March 1945, a laboratory worker at Bonn University found a crumpled document in a toilet that changed the scope of the mission. Known as the Osenberg List, it was a catalog of scientists and engineers considered essential to the German war effort. Those names would become targets for American agents racing against the advancing Red Army. The initial program to bring these specialists to America was called Project Overcast. Its official purpose was to interrogate about 100 prominent German scientists and employ them for 6 months to help fight Japan. Yet by August 1945, the war against Japan had ended. American planners saw a new threat rising in the Soviet Union and recognized that German expertise could tip the balance in the coming Cold War. The mission shifted from short-term interrogation to long-term exploitation. Paperclips were attached to the dossiers of candidates with troublesome backgrounds, giving the operation its later nickname. President Harry Truman approved the program in August 1946 on the condition that no known or alleged war criminals would be recruited. The Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, created to run the project, quickly learned that the most valuable scientists had been party members or worse. To avoid losing them to the Soviets, officials simply removed incriminating evidence from their files. The promise of a fresh start in America outweighed moral qualms for both recruiters and recruits. Behind the scenes there was already fierce competition. The United States knew that the Soviet Union was running its own sweep, later called Operation Osenberg, which would deport thousands of German specialists eastward in a single night. American officers wanted to secure not only the technologies, jet engines, chemical weapons, rocket designs, but also the people who understood them intimately. At the top of the Osenberg List was Wernher von Braun, a charismatic engineer who had led the V-2 ballistic missile program at Peenemünde. Von Braun was a member of the Nazi Party and held a commission in the SS. He oversaw a program that used tens of thousands of concentration camp prisoners in underground factories. More than 20,000 people died in the Mittelwerk tunnels, according to a non-profit account. He personally recruited laborers from Buchenwald, and more than 3,000 of his missiles rained down on London and Antwerp, killing at least 9,000 civilians. Yet his engineering prowess was undeniable. When American forces reached Germany, von Braun and about 125 colleagues hid their V-2 documents in caves, stole a train and waited to surrender to the Americans. His younger brother Magnus approached U.S. troops waving a white flag and told them where to find the rocket team and their cache. They were promptly whisked away to the United States as War Department special employees. Von Braun's group arrived at Fort Bliss, Texas, and White Sands Proving Grounds, New Mexico, in 1946. The Germans helped the U.S. Army test captured V-2 rockets and develop prototypes of cruise missiles. In 1950, the team moved to Redstone Arsenal in Alabama to build ballistic missiles. Von Braun, meanwhile, cultivated an image as a visionary by writing magazine articles and appearing on television to explain space travel. After the Soviet Union launched Sputnik in 1957, his group, now numbering in the thousands and largely naturalized as U.S. citizens, helped launch America's first satellite, Explorer I. When NASA was formed in 1958, von Braun's division became the core of the Marshall Space Flight Center. He would design the Saturn V rocket that carried astronauts to the moon and later received the National Medal of Science. Such achievements make him an American hero in many eyes, yet they cannot erase his complicity in Nazi crimes and forced labor. The rocket team represented only a fraction of Operation Paperclip's intake. Roughly 1,600 German scientists, engineers and technicians, and their families, were relocated to the United States. Early recruits included experts in aerodynamics, guidance systems, jet and rocket propulsion, and aerospace medicine. The U.S. Air Force, Navy, and civilian agencies placed them in laboratories, universities, and private companies. Many were dispersed in small groups, which kept their presence out of the spotlight. In some disciplines they accelerated American progress. In others their impact was limited because American research programs were already underway. What unified them was the promise of residency and eventual citizenship in exchange for expertise. At the same time, their past political affiliations were minimized or hidden. The Cold War logic was simple. Better to have them working for us than for the Soviets. This moral compromise did not sit well with everyone. Eleanor Roosevelt and Albert Einstein were among prominent critics who warned against giving sanctuary to former Nazis. They believed that importing war criminals undermined the principles for which the Allies had fought. American officials responded by insisting that only good Nazis would be accepted, a claim that was disingenuous at best. While Truman's directive excluded known or alleged war criminals, agents circumvented it. Paperclips on dossiers signified that inconvenient details had been paper-clipped to the back rather than the front. Over time, public memory of the operation faded, replaced by images of rockets lifting toward the heavens. Beyond von Braun, there were other figures whose contributions and transgressions illuminate the program's complexities. Arthur Rudolph was an engineer who had managed production at Mittelwerk, the subterranean factory where V-2 rockets were assembled by prisoners. Approximately 20,000 inmates died in those tunnels. After the war, Rudolph became a key figure in America's missile and space programs, serving as project manager for the Saturn V rocket. In the late 1970s, a survivor of Mittelwerk wrote a book that renewed scrutiny of his wartime role. The U.S. Justice Department opened an investigation, and rather than face a trial, Rudolph renounced his American citizenship in 1984 and returned to Germany. His case shows how long it took for accountability to catch up with some paperclip recruits. Hubertus Strughold was another problematic figure. As the Luftwaffe's chief of aeromedical research, he oversaw experiments on concentration camp prisoners at Dachau. According to later investigations, prisoners were submerged in ice water, placed in low-pressure chambers, and subjected to brutal endurance tests. Yet after arriving in the United States, he pioneered space medicine. Strughold helped design pressurized suits and life support systems for the Gemini and Apollo missions. For decades, the American space medicine community lauded him, even naming an award after him. Only in the 1990s did revelations about his past lead organizations to strip his name from honors and reconsider his legacy. Strughold died quietly in 1986, having never faced trial. Kurt Debus, a former V-2 test engineer and member of the SS, became the first director of NASA's Launch Operations Center, later the Kennedy Space Center, in Florida. He had been present at the Buchenwald concentration camp on at least one occasion and directed rocket launches at Peenemünde. Under his leadership, the Cape Canaveral facility evolved into the heart of America's crewed spaceflight program. Debus frequently appeared in photographs with Presidents John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson during the 1960s. Like von Braun and Rudolph, he built a second career by placing his expertise at America's disposal while his past receded into the background. The Air Force's recruitment of Hans von Ohain, the co-inventor of the turbojet engine, shows how paperclip reached beyond rockets. Von Ohain had developed jet propulsion technology for Germany. After the war, he worked at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio. His British counterpart, Sir Frank Whittle, who had independently invented the jet engine, visited the Smithsonian Institution decades later and posed for a photograph with von Ohain. Their meeting symbolized the blending of once rival technologies under a new banner. Many paperclip scientists contributed quietly to fields such as guided missiles, supersonic aerodynamics, control systems, and aerospace medicine. Their work helped accelerate the development of ballistic missiles that would carry nuclear warheads. The program also fed into civilian industries. Companies like Bell Aircraft, General Electric, and Hughes Aircraft hired former German experts. This diffusion of expertise made it harder for the public to track who had been a Nazi and who had not. Some scientists obtained patents and built prosperous careers. Others struggled with English, culture shock, and the weight of their pasts. In this period, the Soviet Union, Britain, and France were running parallel programs to capture German knowledge. The Soviets relocated entire factories, including the Mittelwerk V-2 plant and the Luftwaffe's Aviation Test Center, to Soviet territory. They conscripted German engineers as foreign experts and treated their work as war reparations. Western officials argued that because the Soviets were seizing talent by force, the United States needed to offer inducements to win the same talent voluntarily. The moral calculus of the early Cold War thus became a competition over who would benefit from the remnants of Hitler's regime. As Paperclip unfolded, internal reports occasionally acknowledged the uncomfortable truth that many recruits had been members of the Nazi Party or even the SS. Roughly half of the early Paperclip specialists had joined the Nazi Party, some opportunistically and others as true believers. A smaller number had joined paramilitary organizations like the SA and the SS. The rapid deterioration of relations with the Soviet Union after 1945 made American officials more willing to overlook such affiliations. They argued that the scientists' knowledge of rockets, jets, and nerve agents was too valuable to discard. Critics countered that this pragmatism came at the cost of justice for victims. The case of Georg Ricke illustrates both the rare exceptions and the prevailing impunity. Ricke had been director of Mittelwerk and was implicated in the use of slave labor and extrajudicial executions. He was brought to the United States under Paperclip, but later extradited to Germany for the Dachau trials. Ricke was indicted for collaborating with the SS and Gestapo, but he was ultimately acquitted. He returned to the United States and continued his career, suggesting how little accountability there was even when trials occurred. Decades later, the U.S. Justice Department would pursue a handful of elderly former Nazis under the Office of Special Investigations, but by then, most Paperclip scientists had retired or died. Public awareness of Operation Paperclip remained limited for decades because the program was classified and because its narrative conflicted with popular portrayals of World War II. When the New York Times and Newsweek reported on Paperclip in 1946, there was an immediate outcry. Government officials reassured the public that only apolitical scientists had been recruited. Yet the files released in the 1980s painted a different picture. Scholars and journalists revealed how the Joint Chiefs of Staff's 1945 memo had characterized the desired experts as rare minds whose continuing intellectual productivity we wish to use, and how many of those minds had been complicit in atrocities. The release of documents sparked debates about whether America's space program had been built on a foundation of moral compromise. Understanding Operation Paperclip requires grappling with its impact as well as its ethical cost. The program accelerated America's entry into the missile age and gave the United States an edge in the early Cold War. Von Braun's Saturn V rocket propelled astronauts toward the moon, and the research of former Nazi physicians contributed to aviation medicine. At the same time, the program shielded men who had participated in mass murder and human experimentation. Many victims never saw justice, and many perpetrators remade themselves into respectable American citizens. Paperclip shows how national security considerations can lead governments to make morally dubious bargains. When we watch footage of rockets soaring into space or celebrate milestones in science and technology, it is worth remembering the tangled roots of those achievements. Operation Paperclip was born from fear of Soviet dominance and the desire to harness knowledge that might otherwise be lost or used against the West. It brought to the United States people whose expertise helped shape the modern world. It also blurred the line between right and wrong, allowing war criminals to escape punishment as long as they were useful. The legacy of Paperclip is a cautionary tale about the choices nations make in moments of crisis and how those choices reverberate through history. In telling this story, we are compelled to confront the uncomfortable truth that the race to space was not only a triumph of human ingenuity, but also a product of human frailty and moral compromise. In the end, Operation Paperclip asks us to consider whether scientific progress can ever be separated from the ethics of those who advance it, and whether ends can truly justify the means. The last year of World War II left the European continent in ruins. Cities from Warsaw to Cologne were piles of rubble, and industries lay shattered. Yet amid this devastation, there were laboratories and factories where German scientists had achieved startling breakthroughs. The V-2 rocket represented the world's first long-range ballistic missile, while the first combat jets and sophisticated armor had already reached the battlefield. The Nazis had also stockpiled chemical munitions and begun to explore nuclear fission. As Allied troops crossed the Rhine and the Red Army closed in on Berlin, commanders understood that the war would end before they could capture all of this technology. Teams of experts roamed through laboratories in the Harz Mountains, Bavarian castles and underground bunkers, cataloging equipment, collecting documents, and interrogating personnel. It was a race not just for victory, but for technological inheritance. Washington's planners recognized that to harness such knowledge they needed an organized effort. The Combined Intelligence Objectives Subcommittee, CIOS, assembled more than 3,000 technical experts and reconnaissance teams. These specialists fanned out across liberated territories to identify research facilities and interview personnel. Their initial directive focused on special weapons, nuclear, biological, and chemical, and the means to deliver them. Reports produced by the CIOs confirmed that German scientists were far ahead of the Allies in several fields, including jet aircraft and advanced armor. In July 1945, the Joint Chiefs of Staff issued a classified memo titled Exploitation of German Specialists in Science and Technology in the United States, which described selected scientists as rare minds whose continuing intellectual productivity we wish to use. The memo never reached President Truman, but it guided the recruitment drive. The Osenberg List, recovered from the toilet in Bonn, provided names and disciplines. Major Robert B. Staver of the U.S. Army used it to expand the scope of Operation Overcast beyond the original 100 interrogations. Wernher von Braun himself was a study in contradictions. Born into an aristocratic family, he developed an early fascination with rocketry and joined a society of amateur rocket enthusiasts in his youth. He studied physics and engineering and quickly rose to become the technical director of the German Army's rocket program at Peenemünde. To secure resources, he joined the Nazi Party and accepted a commission in the SS. Under his direction, engineers turned the dream of spaceflight into the lethal reality of the V-2 missile, a 30-ton rocket that traveled faster than the speed of sound. The V-2's guidance system, propulsion, and aerodynamics were revolutionary, but its production was inseparable from brutality. After Allied bombing raids destroyed Peenemünde, production moved to the Mittelwerk tunnels near Nordhausen. Tens of thousands of prisoners from Buchenwald and other camps were forced to work underground in horrific conditions. Many died from starvation, disease, and executions. Von Braun later claimed that he was a technocrat who cared only about reaching the stars, but survivors remembered him touring the tunnels and ignoring their suffering. The satirist Tom Lehrer captured this moral blindness in a song. Once the rockets are up, who cares where they come down? That's not my department, says Wernher von Braun. When the German rocket team arrived in Texas, they were initially isolated and under guard. Officially classified as prisoners of war and later as War Department special employees, they lived in barracks surrounded by barbed wire and needed passes to leave the base. They called themselves POPs, prisoners of peace, and knew that their status depended on their usefulness. Many began learning English and American customs. They gave lectures to Army personnel, played string quartets on Saturday nights, and built small rockets to demonstrate principles of propulsion. In the desert outside El Paso, they supervised the launch of captured V-2s as part of a program that gathered data on the upper atmosphere. At first, their wives and children were left behind in Germany. Eventually, families were allowed to immigrate and settled near Fort Bliss, forming a community that would later relocate en masse to Huntsville, Alabama. The scientists experienced culture shock, Texas heat, American food, differences in religion, but they also encountered opportunities unimaginable in post-war Germany. Their children enrolled in American schools and began to lose their accents, while their parents were granted increasing freedom as their value became apparent. The Redstone Arsenal assignment marked the next stage in the integration of the rocket team into the American military-industrial complex. At Redstone, they developed medium-range ballistic missiles and collaborated with American engineers on guidance systems and liquid fuel engines. The PGM-11 Redstone missile became the basis for America's first live nuclear ballistic weapon, while the Jupiter C and Juno launch vehicles derived from Redstone technology were used to launch early satellites. Von Braun's engineers worked on theoretical studies of staging and propulsion that would inform later designs. Their expertise accelerated the ballistic missile program, giving the United States credible deterrence as the nuclear arms race intensified. Although American rocketeers existed before Paperclip, the infusion of German experience provided tested design philosophies, especially in areas such as turbopump construction and engine cooling. At the same time, American universities began to train a new generation of aerospace engineers who would eventually eclipse their German mentors. Operation Paperclip was far more than the story of rockets. The 1,600 specialists who came to the United States encompassed chemists, physicists, physicians, metallurgists, engineers, and psychologists. Some developed supersonic wind tunnels and improved jet engines, enabling the X-plane program that would carry pilots beyond the sound barrier. Others worked on guidance and control systems, laying the foundation for modern avionics. Aeromedical researchers studied the effects of acceleration and weightlessness on the human body, information that would inform pilot training and later spaceflight. Not all contributions were beneficial. Several chemists had worked on nerve agents, and while American officials claimed such knowledge would be used defensively, the mere presence of these experts suggested an arms race in chemical warfare. The program's breadth meant that traces of paperclip were woven into many Cold War technologies, from weather satellites to intercontinental missiles, even if the names of the Germans involved remained largely unknown. Arthur Rudolph's career exemplified the uneasy coexistence of achievement and atrocity. A mechanical engineer, Rudolph had been operations director at Mittelwerk, overseeing slave labor and production quotas. Under Paperclip, he was placed at the Guided Missile Development Division in Huntsville and became project manager for the Pershing and later the Saturn V rockets. His leadership contributed directly to the successful Apollo missions. In the late 1970s, however, a survivor's memoir drew attention to his wartime role. The U.S. Justice Department's Office of Special Investigations accused him of participating in Nazi war crimes. Rather than face denaturalization proceedings, Rudolph surrendered his U.S. citizenship in 1984 and returned to West Germany. His case was unusual, not because he was guilty. Many paperclip scientists had similar histories, but because someone attempted to hold him accountable. Kurt Debus and Hubertus Strughold likewise avoided prosecution. Debus served as director of NASA's launch operations, steering the Cape Canaveral facility through the Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo eras. Strughold, who had overseen hypothermia experiments on Dachau prisoners, became known as the father of space medicine after developing pressurized suits and life support systems for astronauts. Only in the 1990s did revelations about his past lead organizations to strip his name from honors. These examples show how accountability for paperclip scientists was the exception rather than the rule. On the other side of the Iron Curtain, the Soviet Union implemented its own plan to capitalize on German science. In October 1946, the Red Army orchestrated Operation Osenberg, a single-night operation that forcibly relocated more than 6,000 German specialists and their families to the Soviet Union. Soviet authorities dismantled factories, laboratories, and even entire research institutes, shipping them east. Engineers who had worked on rockets, aircraft, optics, and chemicals found themselves designing engines and missiles for Joseph Stalin's arsenal. Unlike Operation Paperclip, Osenberg offered no employment contracts. The Germans were compelled to work under military supervision as a form of war reparations. Their contributions fed into the development of Soviet intercontinental ballistic missiles and the R-7 rocket that launched Sputnik. The existence of Osenberg fueled American urgency and provided justification for recruiting former Nazis. If the Soviets were turning German knowledge against the West, American officials argued, then the United States was morally obligated to do the same, even if that meant making deals with men whose hands were stained with blood. When news of Operation Paperclip leaked to the press in late 1946, reactions were mixed. The New York Times and Newsweek exposed the recruitment of former Nazi scientists. Letters to editors decried the hypocrisy of sheltering men who had built Hitler's war machine. Eleanor Roosevelt wrote that the program violated the spirit of the Nuremberg trials, while Albert Einstein warned that employing war criminals would degrade America's moral standing. Military leaders countered that the scientists had been coerced into joining the Nazi Party and that America faced a new enemy. To reassure the public, officials emphasized that all recruits were vetted and that none had participated in atrocities, a statement that was demonstrably false. In fact, the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency deliberately ignored evidence of Nazi affiliations. The files remained classified, and for decades the details of Paperclip were known only to a few historians and journalists. Popular culture celebrated von Braun and his colleagues as space pioneers without acknowledging their pasts. It was not until the 1980s that the U.S. government declassified many of the Paperclip files. Historians gained access to dossiers showing how recruiters had sanitized biographies and how officials had justified the inclusion of party members and SS officers. Books and documentaries revealed that roughly half of the early paperclip specialists had been members of the Nazi Party, and that some had joined the SS or SA. The revelations forced NASA and other institutions to confront their founding myths. Awards and buildings bearing the names of former Nazis were quietly renamed. School curricula and museum exhibits began to mention forced labor and the ethical cost of scientific progress. The conversation shifted from one of simple celebration to one of critical reflection about the price of Cold War victories. Many paperclip scientists embraced their new lives wholeheartedly. They bought houses, mowed lawns, and attended church picnics. Their children grew up in suburbia and enlisted in the U.S. military. Some divorced German spouses and remarried Americans. Others struggled with guilt or were ostracized by neighbors who learned of their past. Local newspapers in Texas and Alabama ran human interest stories about the German rocket boys, depicting them as quirky geniuses adjusting to barbecue and baseball. The community in Huntsville, nicknamed Rocket City, celebrated its heritage with festivals and museums. When the Apollo 11 crew walked on the moon in 1969, Huntsville held a parade for von Braun and his team. For many Americans, these immigrants were indistinguishable from other Europeans who had come seeking opportunity. Only decades later did a more nuanced picture emerge, one that acknowledged the privileges and protections they received compared with other refugees or immigrants. As the 1950s progressed, the knowledge gleaned from paperclip fueled a new arms race centered on intercontinental ballistic missiles. Engineers at Redstone Arsenal and private contractors across the country pursued designs capable of carrying nuclear warheads across oceans. The Soviet launch of Sputnik and later missions underscored the stakes of the competition. Von Braun argued that robust investment in rocket research could close the perceived missile gap, and his proposals influenced the deployment of the Atlas, Titan, and Minuteman missiles. Military planners spoke openly about mutual assured destruction, a doctrine that might never have emerged so quickly without the accelerated learning curve provided by former Nazis. The specter of missiles ready to fly at a moment's notice hung over the world for decades, a legacy in which paperclip played a hidden but significant role. The ethical controversy surrounding paperclip was intertwined with the post-war reckoning that produced the Nuremberg Code and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. At Nuremberg, prosecutors documented the medical atrocities committed in concentration camps, including the hypothermia and low-pressure experiments overseen by Luftwaffe physicians. The resulting code established that human experimentation requires informed consent and that scientists bear responsibility for the consequences of their work. Yet even as the code was written, men like Hubertus Strughold were being flown to the United States to continue research. Critics pointed to this contradiction. How could a nation champion human rights while benefiting from knowledge extracted through torture? Military leaders responded with a utilitarian argument that using such knowledge could save thousands of American lives in future conflicts. The tension between deontological ethics and consequentialist reasoning has persisted in debates about paperclip ever since. It has also influenced contemporary discussions about whether to use data derived from unethical experiments. In this way, paperclip is not just a historical episode, but a case study in the philosophy of science. Life in America was a complex mixture of gratitude and dissonance for many paperclip families. Housing provided by the Army was often basic, yet it was far superior to the bombed-out apartments they had left. Some scientists felt guilt leaving their war-torn homeland, while others saw their relocation as liberation from a totalitarian regime. They navigated a country grappling with its own issues of segregation and social change. In Huntsville, their children attended schools that were being desegregated under federal orders. They witnessed civil rights marches and listened to speeches by Martin Luther King Jr. The juxtaposition of American ideals and American realities offered its own lessons in hypocrisy. Several former Nazis became active members of local churches and civic organizations, seeking redemption or simply acceptance. Oral histories collected decades later reveal a range of emotions: relief at having survived the war, pride in technological achievements, shame about complicity in atrocities, and ambivalence about their adopted country. Museums such as the U.S. Space and Rocket Center celebrate the achievements of the engineers who put Americans on the moon. Exhibits often mention the German origins of rocket technology, but the ethical context is sometimes relegated to side panels. Scholars continue to argue about the extent of Paperclip's contribution to the space race. Some contend that American innovation would have prevailed regardless. Others assert that without German expertise, the United States would have fallen years behind the Soviet Union. Regardless of where one stands, there is consensus that Paperclip accelerated the exchange of ideas across borders, albeit under conditions shaped by war and ideology. As private companies now launch rockets and talk about colonizing Mars, the questions first raised by Paperclip about the sources of knowledge and the responsibilities of those who wield it remain relevant. Scientific progress does not occur in a vacuum. It is inseparable from history, politics, and ethics. Remembering Operation Paperclip requires holding multiple truths simultaneously. It is true that the program saved valuable knowledge from falling into Soviet hands and thereby strengthened the Western position in a dangerous era. It is also true that the program protected men who should have been held to account. Public memory tends to prefer simple narratives, heroes and villains, triumphs and tragedies separated by clear boundaries. Paperclip defies such neat categorization. Its participants were human beings capable of both brutality and brilliance. Its architects were patriots and pragmatists who believed they were acting in the national interest. Its critics were idealists who feared that moral compromise would poison the fruits of scientific progress. Historians must piece together declassified documents, survivor testimonies, and engineering reports to tell a story that acknowledges the light and the shadows. In doing so, we honor the victims of the Nazi regime and recognize the contributions of those who built the rockets that carried humans beyond Earth. We also learn a lesson about the dangers of letting expedience override principle. The program has become a cautionary tale in ethics courses and popular culture, illustrating how seemingly distant atrocities can shape present-day technology. As we grapple with emerging technologies, such as artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, and autonomous weapons, the questions raised by Paperclip resonate more strongly than ever. Are we willing to overlook potential harms in pursuit of competitive advantage? Who gets to decide when the ends justify the means? Remembering the full scope of Operation Paperclip encourages us to demand accountability, promote transparency, and ensure that innovation serves humanity. It challenges future generations to build a world where scientific achievement is inseparable from human rights for everyone.